afternoon and a very warm welcome to the 9th event in the series called Böll.Global 90 Threats and Breaches of the Law, the Current Situation on the Polish-Belarus border is the title. We are still welcoming a number of people. Now, I would like to most cordially welcome you. I'm Laila Al-Subaidi. I'm the Deputy Director of International Department at the HBS. Now, Global is a program in the course of which we have focused on the pandemic so far, but we would like to also look beyond. And of course, we would like to benefit from the presence of our representatives abroad. They are experts. Now, a bit of housekeeping first and foremost, so that you know the structure of this event. I will ask questions to our guests, and after 50 minutes or so, I will open the floor to you, dear audience. And of course, you can use the Q&A chat, which you find on the menu on your screen, at the bottom of your screen, so that you can ask questions, and my colleague will collect your questions and will pass them on to me. And of course, if you have problems, please also use the chat. And you can also use the little globe you see at the bottom of your screen if you want to pick a language, because this event is being translated. Now, we have looked at the EU eastern border, and the situation has become increasingly precarious by driving thousands of refugees and migrants to the Polish border. Alexandr Lukaschenko has triggered a crisis intended to hit the EU where it hurts most. Now, instead of trying to get support from the EU agency of Frontex, Poland sent 50,000 soldiers to the border. The EU passed a second program of sanctions against Belarus, while Poland acted on. Now, there are a number of emergency measures, fast-track trials on the border included, but this is not sufficient, Poland says. Now, the overall situation is a quite complex one. It's a political mix, and the suffering ones are thousands of people who have to stay in camps or hide in the forest in spite of the ice-cold temperatures. Now, of course, we have heard lots of questions, including what should be done, what should we do? Now, I'm happy to welcome our guest, Joanna Stolarek, the director of our Warsaw office. She's a journalist. I'm also happy to welcome Johannes Vosswinkel. He's the director of our Kiev office. Welcome, Johannes. And he's also dealing with Belarus, or dealing with Belarusian affairs from his office in Kiev. Dr. Bente Scheller is also here with us. She's the director of the Middle East and North Africa Department. And David Kipp is here. I'm very happy to have him with us. David Kipp is a scientist at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Now, Joanna, may I start with you? Please tell us, what is the current situation at the border? What is happening? How many people are actually there? Thank you, Laila. Nobody knows how many people are there on the spot at the border. Nobody is counting. The NGOs are not allowed to enter the emergency zone. The Polish government just a few days ago passed a new law according to which the emergency situation is being extended, which is actually illegal. You can't do this. And yet they decided to prolong the emergency situation, which means that the media and NGOs and aid organizations are not allowed to enter the zone. The media are allowed, there are exceptions, so to speak. So if they get a laissez-passer, they are allowed to enter the zone. An ombudsperson was also allowed to enter the zone, and yet he was stopped by the police. So I'd say it's an illegal, a lawless zone. Now, in the border zone, we have a forest, which is probably the thickest in Europe, and it's really hard to get through. There are swamps, it's really cold. And the aid organizations, I mean, this might sound contradictory because there are Polish NGOs that want to enter the zone. There is one working near the border, and they are actually moving into the forest, trying to find the people, trying to detect them in order to help them. Because these people are stranded, so to speak. They are there without any food, without any clothes, and it's cold, as I said. So the NGOs really try to enter the forest because there is no other way to offer help. The people who have landed there are not the ones who've been pushed back by the Polish military and the Polish border police and the Polish paramilitary services. These are the three agencies actually who are securing or controlling the border, and they are the ones to push the people back who try to come over. We hear from the border region that it's not big groups that try to move across the border, it's smaller groups like 10 people or so. And yet they are being stopped. Some of the people who've been caught were put in camps in impossible conditions. Others were just put on a plane and they were sent back to Iraq or other places. But there are still lots of people who are there, hidden in the forest, and they want to move on. They want to reach Europe, and they are afraid to return, and they don't want to go to Belarus either. They're afraid to go there too. Last night, the vice ombudswoman, well, last night I met the deputy ombudswoman, Anna Granitska. She was there and she really told horrible, moving stories, like the one of a little child, a 4-year-old child who got lost in the forest. It was cold, there was snow. So people are truly suffering, and actually we are still waiting for the reaction of shock and anger in Europe, and for people who would go and say something needs to be done. They need something to eat, they need something to drink, they need protection and help all these people. No matter whether they are recognized refugees or not, no matter whether they are allowed to make to apply for asylum or not. Now, there are attempts made to tell the refugees what their situation is, what their right is. And sometimes they are getting information from the border police, but then more often than not, they are just put in a car and brought back to the forest. So it's an impossible and an awful situation, and we clearly see that this is the dictate of the Belarusian side, because they try to make policy with the people, but the people in the forest are not the guilty ones. It's the man in Minsk who is to blame. So he has the main responsibility for what we are seeing. Right. You spoke about the Polish civil society. You said that people try to offer help, humanitarian aid. But what about society at large? I mean, there is a hardline policy of the government. Is there criticism of this policy in the country, in the society? Now, actually, since 2015, Poland has had a very anti-migrant, anti-refugee policy, a narrative actually, which controls society and which is directed against refugees and migrants. Now, when migrants and refugees were accepted in Germany in 2015, there was a real campaign against migration and against refugees in Poland. So there is not much willingness to accept refugees in Poland. There's only a rather weak support for those who say we need to accept these people in our country. The bulk, the majority of the society truly subscribes to the government policy, agrees to what is being done. And actually, it's for the first time since World War II that Poland sees itself obliged to protect its borders. And that's the argument people are using. I mean, this is also about the Polish history, right? And it's also about the narrative, which is being told, which has been told for years. And it's also about ignorance, and it's also about fear. But then there are also those heroes who try to help. And there are people in the special zone, more than 180 villages and little towns, where people live who are immediately concerned and immediately affected and try to help. But this is actually much too much. I mean, it's difficult to live your ordinary life if all of a sudden you have another family living in your garden. The Polish government implements this particular policy also in order to be successful on the domestic policy side. The Polish church also intervened, and there was an appeal made by Polish bishops, and Caritas Polska, for example, is in the border region, because they say you need to be free to practice your religion, and if you practice your religion, you need to offer help on the spot as well. But it's a scandal what we are seeing. We do see dramatic scenes where Poles, for example, are offering help, carrying people, refugees in their cars, bringing them to other places, and then are being accused of smuggling in human beings. Now we will talk about Belarus in a minute. But since you've mentioned Lukashenko and the EU, I mean, there is not much protection for refugees in the EU in general, but there is also a conflict between Poland and the EU, which involves the question of values. So you say the Polish government uses this particular policy for domestic policy purposes, but what about foreign policy and the crisis? Well, actually, the Polish government does what it does in order to make people look away or turn away from the conflicts between the EU and Poland, and also in order to overlook the economic situation of the country, which is not a good one. An 8% inflation is a major problem. So the government tries to present itself in a very proactive way, in a very powerful way, and they try to pretend, right, we can cope. No worry. And we don't accept any extortion either. And actually, they are also arguing that what they do for the benefit of the EU. Actually, the EU should be grateful, they say, because we protect the eastern border of the European Union. Now, the Polish coalition lost one of its partners a few months ago. Thus, it doesn't have a majority in the parliament anymore, and it needs members of parliament, deputies, who agree to the government policy, and thus they are trying to seek the support from right-wing politicians, people who are anti-migrant, who operate on the right-wing fringes. And these politicians, these members of parliament, these voters are needed by the Polish government in order to continue ruling the country. Now, they pretend that Poland is a sovereign state and does what it does correctly, does everything right. Now, actually, a particular situation should prevail in Poland. I mean, this is Christmas is around the corner, and there are real traditions. Like, you leave one seat empty when coming together in your family or in your neighborhood. You leave one seat empty, so if someone comes and needs shelter and food, you can offer a seat and shelter and food. So this tradition prevails, which shows that Poland also has a refugee tradition, so to speak, and people from Poland have fled to countries all over the world, and people are also willing to help. I mean, of course, refugees are returned at the border, and this is being instrumentalized, and people and the refugees don't get the help they need. But on the other hand, we also see humanitarian values which prevail in Poland, in the EU and in Poland. So nobody should die from cold, from hunger. But this is actually what is happening just now. A woman died at the border. And this is a fence, a metal fence, which causes serious injuries if people try to overcome it. But no medical support, no doctors are admitted, are allowed to enter the zone, and this should end.
Damit würde ich jetzt gerne mal überschwenken zu Belarus.
I'd like to pass on to Johannes, who is in Belarus. Johannes, can you tell us more? What is the expectation of Lukashenko? What is his intention? And has he achieved his objectives at all, looking at the most recent sanctions? Can you tell us a little bit more about Belarus and also the situation inside the country? Well, of course, this is a very difficult task to look into the brain of Lukashenko, but there are some obvious things which have played a role at least, and this acting of the Belarus government was triggered by one point, which is of course punishing the European Union in particular, because there is quite a strict attitude after the presidential elections last summer, in summer 2020 in Belarus, and the successive manifestations and riots and the demonstrations which were actually beaten up by the government. This is something which Lukashenko does not pardon the European Union. And now, in the meantime, it's 5. 1 month ago, there were 4 packets of sanctions. Now it's 5. And now, of course, he tries to hit the European Union at places where it's where it hurts especially, and which may also cause a split up of the European Union between different camps. And therefore, from the Belarusian point of view, by the way, it's not the first time that Lukashenko has played that card. He also tried to use it before, and he said that he would do so in order to play this card against the European Union, in order to bring the countries of the European Union apart into different camps. And at the same time, he used the opportunity to distract the population of the domestic repression, migration instead of repression. And migration in particular means, look, as the propaganda is telling the people there, look at the West, who likes to talk about human rights. They don't respect them themselves. In other words, human rights from the Western point of view is just political struggle and or fight. And this is absolutely telling the legend which is spread by Russia, and which is also an aspect which is important. He tries at the same time to take Russia on board a little bit into this migration conflict where migrants are virtually abused. You can't even, well, it is quite a cynical government, and he tries to get Russia on board in this policy. He talked several times to Putin last weeks, of course, also about the situation at the Russian-Polish border. For instance, when Russian bombers were patrolling the border, he also declared this part of the measures for solving the issue at the border. In other words, this shouldering with Russia is something which he also likes to take on. It's also important that he's got another objective in mind. He tried to make people talk about him again, because there is little positive news and positive possibilities of influencing the situation, of getting in contact with the European Union. He just opted for the destructive means. And this was also something to get in, to start talks again with the European Union by using these events at the border, and maybe also to make Europe withdraw from certain attitudes, from certain steps which Europe has undertaken. And now it's to be expected that the Belarusian system itself did not foresee that this very clear Polish reaction and far-reaching solidarity within the European Union will certainly not lead to the objective originally intended by Lukashenko. So you are actually based in Kiev. Can you give us some insights about the other countries and what is their position in this crisis, and what you can hear actually, and what effects can you see? So from the Ukrainian point of view, all these horrible events at the Belarusian-Polish border are far away, actually, first of all. And in Ukraine, they also have got a lot of other problems, so it's understandable when you especially look at the massive build-up of troops at the Russian-Ukrainian border. This is, of course, something which worries many people here in Ukraine. And in all this context, first of all, the conflict between the European Union and Belarus has been observed, and of course, it was very much related to the overall context of a confrontation with Russia, and that also goes for the situation in Ukraine. In other words, it was not so much about the destiny of the refugees at the border. It was much more another building block on this way that Belarus is getting closer, having to get closer to Russia more and more. And this, of course, would mean also worsening of the situation in Ukraine, because we should not forget that Ukraine and Belarus have also a very long border together, more than 1,000 kilometers, which is not secured at all, or hardly secured. And there was also fear in Ukraine, if Poland and the other European countries start this very repelling reaction towards the Lukashenko regime, that Lukashenko could try to use the refugees in the border region also to penetrate this conflict into Ukraine. And the second thing is that the conflict and the urging of Lukashenko into the arms of Russia is something which, from the Ukrainian point of view, looks very frightening, because presently there is a possible threat of war with Russia, which Ukraine is actually expecting, and therefore the possibility of Russian troops crossing the border from Ukrainian point of view would not just come via the Russian border, but also with the Belarusian border. And this is also something which is in line with the conflict between Belarus and Ukraine, which worries people enormously, because Ukraine is feeling more and more isolated. And at the same time, there is also a certain uncertainty how much from Europe or the US support can be expected in case of a conflict. Thank you, Johannes. Now I would like to switch to Bente. A lot has been written about the migrants in Russia, but we know very little about them actually. What we do know is that they have invested a lot of money for their hopes to get to Europe. Some media have mentioned 20,000 euro. Some people sold all their property and the real estates, etc., their homes. And so can you tell us a little bit more? Where do the people come from, and why do they really started their journey? So there are certain different profiles of the people who are now on the run, especially because they also come from different countries and contexts. But as you have said, they sold their property, they sold their asset. Yes, those are the people who do not have so much money that they could also set out for Europe before that time. So mainly, apart from those who are coming from Afghanistan, who also are in great numbers among the people at the border, we do see people from Iraq and from Syria. And there are some people who are coming by plane directly from Syria. That is one of the strongest elements where we could see this instrumentalization. The flights which started from Damascus were certainly not people who are not liked by this regime. Those are people who actually are friendly enough with the regime so that they can also ask for a passport and leave the country for money, of course, because the regime is also in a financial crisis and is desperately looking for money, and so they try to get every dollar from their people. So those people who started the journey in Damascus and came by airplane are clearly those who are one element in the regime politic on the one side, where they started to get richer, where the regime is starting to get rich, and also to get rid of those people, because even though those are the people who might not have had the most serious problems, one thing should be clear: the regime will not take them back. If they hadn't been under pressure before, they certainly will be. By everything they had to invest, due to the fact that they have given up everything in their country. And also when it comes to, let's say, taking them back by airplane to Damascus, certainly they will not be welcome, and in the region it will be very difficult to go somewhere else. This is an experience from Syrians from the Lebanon. We also use other ways to get, for instance, to get out of the country via the Gulf states or via Turkey. And in the Lebanon, Syrians have been living in precarious situations. So those who really collected the money in order to pay the human traffickers, in order to pay the airplane tickets, were already in a very desperate situation before. And many of them believe that this is their only way out. There are sufficient people on the way. There are NGOs and activists who are warning them. They will say you will ending in a dead-end street, which may cost your lives. And they say, well, this is even better, still better than staying here. And especially in the refugee movements from that region, we could see several times they tried over the Mediterranean Sea, many lost their lives, and so the journey on land seems to be the most the even more secure way for them, and many people just ignore the facts that they are actually being abused by the politicians. So this is the problem with them. There are also some refugees from Iraq. I think for them the political pressure is not as high, and many of them have been flown back also, as she said. I think about 2,000 people who had been returned to Iraq by planes. And for them, the situation is not so delicate to get back to their countries. They might have had political reasons too to leave the country, but mainly it was the situation, the desperate situation in Iraq, due to the intervention in 2003 and later by the influence of Iran and also ISIS. A lot of perspectives have been destroyed. So people say, in this region we will never be happy, and there is no future for us. And those mainly are the people who set out on their journey from Iraq, and amongst them they are actually in a less severe situation because they don't have to fear for their lives in the country when they come back, because they will not be treated as traitors, they will not be excluded from the society or from a country where they had been finding protection before. Well, some are being returned by planes. There are some planes which return people. Do you know where they touched down? Do you know what happens to those people? Well, mainly those are the flights towards Iraq. And of course, when you have invested a lot, when you had borrowed money to leave the country, you know, of course, when you are taken back, your condition is much worse than before when you try to get out of the country. And well, the hopelessness will be even higher. And for Lebanon, I know a lot of people who got a prohibition to re-enter the country stamped into their passports. There had been refugees in Lebanon before. There is also a big number of Palestine refugees who have been living there without any perspective for decades, and who hardly have the possibility to get traveling papers or documents. And also people from Syria, we saw this in the past as well. People even who left the country and did all the procedures with the Lebanese authorities are not allowed to come back to this country now. And we have not been able to document any cases, but we are hearing that there are people who were flown back to this place and then were taken to Damascus, especially into the context which they had fled from. That been forced to go there, and there are studies from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch what happens to those so-called voluntary returnees. Sometimes we lose their traces, and maybe they also died under the torture in Syrian prisons. That's cynical, actually. First, they have been encouraged and even recruited to go out of the country. Then they will be returned to those places, and this is really absolutely a no-go under the human rights standards. So the flights from Damascus were actually being closed. So I asked myself whether Moscow really was so happy how far Lukashenko really went, because I can imagine when flights from Damascus are stopped without the agreement of Moscow. Do we know, actually, Johannes Bendler, do we know that there had been any agreements between, let's say, the regime in Damascus and Lukashenko? How everything started when the flights were bringing the refugees to Belarus? Had there been any agreement, or is there hardly any knowledge about that? So when I just can tell you something about the stop of those flights now, Job Cargo is the airline which flew, which it has been sanctioned. It should have been sanctioned for long, because that was an airline which had been involved in a lot of activities against human rights. They also flew mercenaries to Lebanon. So from the very beginning, I really could not see why this airline was not sanctioned by the EU. And I think there were similar talks with Lebanon, so that will certainly lead to major problems by the EU if they don't stop this. But as regards Russia, I'm not so sure actually what the position of the travels from Syria really is, because both countries are actually pursuing a very ambiguous policy. Damascus, on its side tries to normalize things, to signal to the world that everything's safe in the country. Of course, that conflicts with the picture that many people are leaving the country as refugees, rather from Damascus, which is free, which is not a war zone that was declared by Denmark, for example. And that's a narrative which also is disturbing Russia, which has tried for a long time to bring home to the regime to try and make a rather reconciliation policy at the surface, to keep this image in the world. And Russia, of course, wants to be estimated as a guarantor of this situation, and at the same time exerting pressure to the EU has been something which always was to the liking of Russia, due to the refugees from Syria which came through Turkey. Both countries, Russia and Turkey, realized the potential to split up the European Union and to put it under pressure. Thank you, Bente. Now let's speak about EU and David. The human rights violations and legal violations at the border between Belarus and Poland are not only a Belarusian problem, it's also an EU problem. Can you perhaps give us some insight into the situation or the attitude of the EU? Thank you very much. I'm also happy that I'm included in this panel with the various offices, with Bente and Johannes, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. As regards the question, I would like to link to what Bente has just said. She said that Russia and Turkey are aware of the splitting potential of the EU. I would agree with that opinion. And of course, nevertheless, when you just for a moment ignore the very horrible situation at the border which you described, at least the intentions have not come through. One would have to say that the intended split up of the European Union has not happened, was not achieved. That might have been one of the objectives of Lukashenko, also with the, let's say, agreement of Putin. The EU Commission and the member states very clearly stood behind Poland and strengthened their back in the situations, and did not say anything about the pushbacks which also are committed by the Polish side, which do not only conflict with European law but also with international human rights legislation. And what you said at the beginning, what the Commission has proposed last week, is actually the intent to build a bridge for Poland and also Lithuania and Lithuania and Latvia to, let me say, to re-establish a somehow legal situation. We know that the Polish government, as far as I understood, has rejected the proposals, but the proposal is that the acquis of the EU and the asylum issue could be, let's say, interrupted for a certain time, which of course would have consequences for the refugees who make it across the border. We always have to bear in mind that the several thousands who are still being in Belarus, not all of them are at the border. I don't know exactly, but they, of course, would then not come to Poland in such large numbers anymore. But when we really leave this area or this room, kind of a lawless room, and there were lots of people who needed our help. But but before you continue, perhaps could you explain very briefly what these exceptional rules include, just for our audience? As far as I understood, those are mainly 3 points. The refugees could be imprisoned for more time. so that the asylum applications could be extended, so people could be kept in prisons, and that the asylum procedures can be handled directly at the border so that people can be returned, and that the basic needs or the provisions for the basic needs could also be restricted. That includes food, drink, and healthcare. Am I right, or is this wrong?
Well, this is a quite comprehensive document, 26 pages, because they also try to prove that there is still a legal framework in which Poland exists or moves or acts. But I mean, this is about the time the country has in order to register an asylum application, 4 weeks instead of 10 days, for example. Which means that you only get basic treatment in the camps on the border. This is clearly a restriction of the asylum right. But then we know that this right exists on paper in most cases. I mean, we all know of the cases in Greece where they did not respect those rights either. And yet, the EU should actually go and say, you need to allow for applications for asylum. I mean, what the Commission suggests would at least be some kind of an improvement. It's still problematic too, but it would improve the situation, clearly. The question is still, where can you apply for asylum? And I mean, this is certainly a right which can be enjoyed by those who've managed to get across the border. But I guess this is also one of the main aspects the Polish government sees, and one of the main reasons why they want to opt for a new approach, which can be seen from the law they passed last week. They don't want any EU support. They rather collaborate with the UK. The UK also sent troops to protect the Polish border. Now, briefly, in order to assess the situation as a whole, you can go and say that they tried to build a bridge under the given circumstances. But then, on the other hand, it's not really an attempt made by the Commission, which actually should go and protect the treaties, the agreements made. The Commission sent a signal quite quick, according to which they agreed to what was happening. At least they did not criticize any human rights violations, with the exception maybe of the Vice President of the Commission from Greece, who is also having the Greek situation in mind when acting, because there are also a number of problems between Greece and Turkey. And 1.5 years ago, they had to defend the border, the EU border in Greece, i.e. the Greek Turkish border. Protecting the European way of life was the slogan used 2 years ago in the election campaign. Now, the Commission also mentioned diplomatic measures in the paper it adopted 2 weeks ago, like Merkel, who spoke with Putin, with Lukashenko, and also 17 individuals and 11 companies who are on the sanction lists now. I think it's difficult in such a situation to push the reset button. I mean, actually, that's what two colleagues of mine did 2 weeks ago. They argued that the military corridor needs to be discussed on a EU level, but it's not being discussed, and there is still Lukashenko's propaganda, and it's getting increasingly difficult to talk about it. He said that he has a deal with Angela Merkel, according to which several thousand people can be accommodated. Doesn't make things easier. Now, this is an attack against the EU. That's the framing, the narrative, which is being used. But what does it mean with respect to the future? What does it mean when an EU member state with an outer border says we are being attacked? Indeed, the word war has been dropped. Sometimes they call it a hybrid war, sometimes they call it a hybrid attack. But then, okay, let's stick with a war. A war implies other rules and measures. A war is different from peace or from a non-war situation. And actually, we should see the human beings first. This would be the right way to go. So, the concept of war implies stricter rules, not only with respect to Belarus. Look at what the Commission has just suggested, but in general. I mean, maybe the emergency will become the rule. The Commission might make new proposals next week with respect to the border code, including 12 member states, including Poland, in its approach. Now, what we need in view of the instrumentalization of migration is more protection at the borders. And of course, we do need a legally conform pushback option, or a way to have the pushback seem legal. Because in fact, many are pushing back anyway. And of course, this is a somewhat difficult situation for the new government, the new German government. Because in the last few years, there is much more of a focus on a more restrictive approach. And not even the improvement, but just the protection of refugee rights is an important issue on the agenda. It's part of the coalition agreement, but often this protection is not really borne in mind by those who act. The question is, what could be a responsible refugee policy? It's kind of difficult to find partners in this effort. France is not a partner anymore. With Luxembourg alone, we won't manage. We do have a new ministry or a new minister, but the whole new government needs to be settled first and foremost. I'm not sure whether they can act quick enough. I'm not sure whether it was intended, but the very moment would have been the right moment to do something in Germany. And those who are in charge, like Viktor Orban and others, have had a look at the coalition agreement already in order to find out how to act. And I doubt that Germany will find a majority for a different policy in the EU. Now, the consequences, I could talk about them later. Yet the question remains, what should the new government do? Now, this is also one of the questions in the chat, which is why I would like to open the panel for the audience. Luisa, please, could you maybe read one or two questions to us, and then we will have one round of answers, and then we have more questions. Sure. And there are lots of interesting questions, especially concerning the new government, which includes the Green Party. And the question is, for example, what is the concept of the Green Party and what will the new foreign minister do in order to overcome the problems at the Polish border? And there are also questions about a greater number of migrants and refugees to be accepted by Germany, in Germany, on a voluntary basis. Now, these would be two questions I would like to suggest now. There will be more later. Well, I guess, David, this is certainly a question for you, or these are questions for you, but if someone else wants to jump in, please feel free. Well, I cannot answer on behalf of the Green Party, but I could talk about the scope. And I would like to start off with a positive remark, because I think we are dealing with a paradigm shift. And that's what the coalition agreement is about. It includes lots of important demands, which have also been raised by scholars and scientists in the last few years, and they've hardly ever been heard. Like laws, the national legislation is certainly a field where a lot could be done. For example, with respect to the toleration or the right of abode and right of residence for migrants and refugees in order to give those people a future. Now, as far as foreign migration policy is concerned, we also find a number of statements in the coalition agreement. There are ideas concerning humanitarian reception or intake programs or resettlement programs. Now, as far as the current crisis is concerned, well, we don't find that particular crisis directly in the coalition agreement. And this is certainly a somewhat difficult heritage for the new government. Of course, Germany could go and say, okay, let's accept a number of people from the border region with the help of international aid organizations. just like what Lukashenko agreed on with Angela Merkel. He tends to say that he agreed with Merkel on this acceptance of refugees, in spite of the fact that people deny it. Which would be different actually than just trying to organize how to return those people, how to send them back. Right. Maybe Johannes, you could add a statement concerning an agreement between Lukashenko and Merkel. Well, actually, Lukashenko tends to say what he wants to say in a given moment. Maybe there was an agreement, maybe not. There were lots of debates also about the question whether it was right to make a phone call, to talk with him on the phone at all. Now, this aggravated the conflict on the one hand, but at the same time, Lukashenko got a way out, because by signaling the willingness to talk to Europe, he could tell his people, okay, look, they talked to me, they spoke with me, and thus this compromise became possible, i.e. it was possible to reduce the pressure at the border by sending refugees back. And yet we should be skeptical when he says Germany agreed to accept refugees. This does not have to be necessarily true. I mean, I'm not in Belarus, but I know from conversations with people who live there that migrants could become a problem for Lukashenko in his own country. For example, in Minsk, too, unless they are visible at the border. I mean, Lukashenko has always praised himself for having a proper and a well-organized regime, i.e. a government which offers to the people what they need. Now, you see the streets of Minsk, you see the railway station of Minsk, and you see migrants and refugees, and the situation and the image changes. Thus, they could become a problem for Lukashenko. Briefly, there is one more aspect we should bear in mind. The opposition parties also, or members of the opposition in general, in other countries criticized Lukashenko. And I said, he's trying to establish his legitimacy on their backs, so to speak. And there are 900 people in Belarusian prisons, like Masha Kolesnikova's sister. Sorry, not her sister, she's in Warsaw. Anyway, 900 people in an absolute legal vacuum, in a lawless situation without any rights. So this is a very complex situation. And concerning Germany and accepting more refugees, I mean, there is no border which could be closed completely. There is no such thing. So you can get to Germany. If you pay the money, you find someone to get you to Germany. And these people are being accepted, and they do get humanitarian support, of course, and they are treated correctly and justly. They can apply for asylum, and they argue on the basis of their need for protection. And this happens in Brandenburg in Germany. It should also happen in Poland.
Luisa, are there any other questions? Yes, there are. I got several questions asking for the mood within the Polish and Belarusian population with regard to the refugees. There was also mentioned the commitment of the many charity organizations in Poland and what the attitude of the Polish population is regarding the refugees, and also regarding the elections. May this result in peace losing the majority in the country? So what's your take on that? And also the same thing about Belarus. What's the mood within the population? Those were the questions. This is very difficult to say something about Belarus and the attitude of the population. From the Belarusian side, media are accepted to go to the border region, and certain images are also shown of migrants, of attacks on border guards, of very brutally acting Polish border guards and soldiers. So those are the images which we also can see on the international media, because that's also broadcast by the Belarusian mass media. So I actually cannot say what the mood is in Belarus, because we don't get true news. There are some broadcast channels who report on that. For example, the first one who had also some footage from the border. As Johannes has also said, Minsk is also full of migrants who don't have the money anymore to afford a hotel. They are sleeping in the parks, on the banks, etc. And you notice that the situation in Belarus among the population is really tense. If you wear white socks, you may be taken to prison, because they would think you are part of the opposition. So you can just imagine that this is not a country where the situation is what we understand as a normal one in a democracy. And as regards Poland, as I said, the seed of hatred which was spread at the beginning is now flourishing, and so the readiness of the Polish population to help those migrants is very low. And on the other hand, they also try to work a lot with the media. On the other hand, there are also lots of donations in order to make people aware of the situation. You asked me for the numbers. I think the estimates say that there are between 2,000 and 2,500 people, and due to the by raising awareness, the charity organizations think that they would also trigger some human reflexes among the population, so to help each other. This is at least what they hope for. But there is also the narrative that they not are actually officially they are not even talking about human beings. It is very difficult for an ordinary Polish person to identify himself with those refugees. In the right-wing media, there are also news that everything's propaganda, that the images where you could see families and children and injured people is all fake and nothing is true. And due to the fact that no organizations, no MPs are actually admitted to get closer to the border, at least as regards European MPs, not even Frontex people are allowed to get close to the border. This is, of course, a very much disputed organization, but still it would be helpful to have them there. But Polish border guards just want to play the card of a strong man and want make people believe that all those brutal things are not really happening. And they're all, from time to time, you see people who are ill and who have really a humanitarian issue. And as regards the next elections, I'm rather pessimistic that peace might lose votes, even if they have lost the coalition partner. And so they are not as strong as before and not as stable as before. Yet the opposition is very weak and also split up into different factions. And so the strength of the current government is actually using the weakness of the opposition. So I see little opportunities for any change. Presently, at least, the situation does not look like that the migration crisis might change the situation in Poland. And Just one last sentence. There were two MPs, one of the Citizens Coalition and one of the Polish Green Party, opened an office in a city next to the border. They have this right. It's right inside the so-called emergency zone. They wanted to be on site and wanted to help, but they were not admitted. So because they're not getting a rental contract, etc. So a lot of obstacles are being put up to prevent them from getting there, and that now the migration politics of the EU is actually aiming at getting more people next to the border. I remember one statement of a social scientist, Manfarani. He said that the civil societies which build high walls are to the liking of archaeologists, because those people inside those walls will certainly die out. May I just add something about Belarus? As Joanna has said, it's very difficult to get a clear picture about the society there, but you should also not forget that on the one hand, a very big portion of society, as some observers are saying, are just waiting in kind of an apathy after the turn down of the big protest waves last year. The society is now rather perceiving all this in a passive way. Just recently there was a strange link in an opinion poll regarding the popularity of Lukashenko. The link came from Russia, from an opinion poll institute. To what extent they could be working in Belarus is doubtful, but one could imagine that this was possible. So, and they did not even get a hint that there was such a poll. But what the outcome, which now affects Belarus and the people in power, is that they are not enjoying much attraction among the population. There are very few people who think he's doing good politics, and more than 50% are actually of the opinion that he's not performing well. That may, of course, be also a card played by the Russian government in this situation with Belarus, but it is also reflecting that the agreement with the politics of Lukashenko within Belarus is actually not very high. So that may also be the reason why some of his actions seem to be very desperate. Yes, but before you are continuing, I read before that the migration movement out of Belarusia, due to the suppression in Belarus, is also one of the largest movements in this century. Well, playing with numbers is very difficult, but we can see in Kiev how many former partners and activists from the Belarusian society have come here to Ukraine. Some of them also went to Tbilisi, some also to Lithuania. This is also reflecting a situation which is quite of an advantage, because they got rid of those dynamic and effective people, but at the same time it also means that they are losing intelligent people. I've got a question for Bente, and the question is how many refugees you guess are from Damascus? And there's another comment where someone is asking or saying that the paradigm of that Lukashenko has caused the crisis is wrong. And the person is still asking that the reasons for the crisis may also be in the politics of the EU, which uses the situation of Lukashenko and wants to, let's say, discredit the politics of Lukashenko. So maybe... Sorry, Bente, can I just add something? There was another question or comment for you. Yes. Just for translation briefly, I would like to repeat the comment. Namely, in one detail, the person wants to contradict you. Not all people are actually at good terms with the government. Perhaps you can add something about this. Yes, of course, this is a very important point. I do not want to shift the focus of this meeting or towards Syria, but what does it really mean to be at good terms with the government? When I said so, I meant that those people who have fled Syria are actually not prosecuted by the regime. Also know a specific case which is quite common. Many people are also trying to escape military service in Syria because they do not want to become part of the suppressive forces in the country. And the person who mentioned this very important detail is also mentioning one of these cases, that a person has left the country for this reason, and he was at risk of being deported, and very much afraid of that. Yes, rightly so, because many people in the regime mentioned refugees, and when you listen to them, you notice that they feel that all the refugees are traitors. They also were called terrorists, and so any act which is not absolutely expressing loyalty towards the Syrian regime is perceived as an act of getting or against the government. And so, of course, being at good terms with the government is not perhaps the right description. Those people at least will get into trouble when they come back to Syria. And that is why for any person who will be returned to Syria, it will be extremely difficult. That should always be kept in mind also by Europe in its considerations when considering these people as difficult cases. How many people really set on that journey from Damascus is not known. So Sham Wings does not have a very big fleet, but they were flying very frequently, and people who really wanted to book a flight were not on board, because you couldn't even book a flight. You could only book flights on this airline by those fake travel agencies, and all those people are definitely refugees. There were several thousands of them, but how many exactly cannot be said at this time. Let me just add, as regards Lukashenko, it is obvious that this was quite a relatively well-organized action last year, which was then, of course, trying to discredit the West by showing that the West is not living up to its own values, which they always are claiming. That is a representation which also had been used by Russia for a very long time, where human rights very frequently in their narrative are only seen as an instrument of fighting against them. And it's very well tallying with this narrative. And I said already before, they also wanted to make the European Union nervous, and in the best case to split it up into different camps. In another situation, Lukashenko already said that Belarus was one of the countries which was, let's say, preventing refugee flows from getting to Europe. So in other terms, he also said that they felt they were protecting the European Union from the refugees, and now he tried to turn this around and thereby achieving release of sanctions or even the withdrawal of certain sanctions, but he did not succeed, obviously. Thank you. There are two other questions. One is about the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in the discussion about refugees. I would like to get this question answered. And another question regards the EU again, namely, the European Commission seems to be afraid that the Polish government would rather work together with NATO than with the EU in order to solve this crisis. And then the question goes on saying that in order not to be put to the edge, the European Union has proposed to restrict basic rights. How big is the risk that other countries such as Croatia and other bordering countries will use the same narrative? Okay, maybe you start with the Catholic Church, and if you feel so, you can also answer the second question. Yes, let me start with the Catholic Church. As I said, the Catholic Church is also split up, and the Polish church is really highly politicized and also polarizing, not only since peace has come to power. There was such an unholy alliance between the church and the state, the government. You can see this in other subjects, for instance, the ban on abortion, etc., which is not today's subject. But the church in Poland was so close to the Polish government that they first kept very silent about the situation and also continued the same narrative as the government by saying that Poland has the right to defend its borders. But later, some, let me say, some dissident bishops made statements, even in writing, by saying that Poland has to accept humanitarian assistance for the people to protect these people from dying out of the cold and hunger, etc. So there are clearly two camps, as there are also two camps, just in adding the question about the population. On the one hand, there is support among the population. There was also huge readiness for donations and for the charity organizations. But in this very split population, there is also, for instance, a call for writing postcards to the soldiers who are based at the border. So children were actually asked to write postcards to the border guards. There was also a concert with Lou Bega, with some foreign artists, just for the soldiers at the border. So those are just warlike, let's say, images which are thereby spread. And the fact that Poland is rather relying on NATO than on the EU is true. It can be seen that the Article 4 has almost been invoked when a country is threatened. Other countries have to stand in. However, it was not invoked. This situation was not applied, also because when I say Poland, I mean Polish government. Poland is unwilling to accept help from the EU. They also want to be seen as the guardians of Europe, as Christian Europe. You just have to go back to history in that many years ago, the Polish troops under Jan Sobieski also saved the Polish country, or have saved Poland from the Turks. And they try to bring back these images and these narratives and call back these historic events. And there's one question on the chat which I could see. The question is whether Poland will now try to use the punishment by the European Court in order not to pay the fines to avoid abiding by the rule of law. I do think that the Polish government will try to use the situation to say, look, we are defending Europe and you are punishing us, you are fining us. So this certainly will be one of the attempts of Poland. If I just may step in, there was a ceremonial of the AfD in front of the Polish embassy recently in Berlin, where they spoke of the defense of the Christian area against the Muslims, and were honoring Poland for this defense on behalf of Europe. We should not forget of that as well, that there are also alliances between the Polish government and the right-wing forces in Germany. Not only in Germany, Marine Le Pen also visited Warsaw just recently. Okay, I've still got something to add. Yes.
Let me add. Today, Merkel's era comes to an end. And in the Böll.Zeitung, we could read for 2 weeks that he said, I'm actually the counter offer. And I mean, seclusion, shielding off borders by fences makes sense. I mean, of course, you're right. You cannot close a border completely, but you can make lots of people suffer. And of course, it has reduced the number of people who have reached Europe in the last few years. If you look at the number of people who have reached Europe or Germany in the last few years, we all know that much more would be possible. But the new government must not only see the immediate situation, but they also have to see the other member states which move in the same direction, like Croatia, Greece, Malta. And then, of course, you look at Libya and you look at Frontex and the European policy in the Mediterranean. Now, these conflicts are no new ones. They have been worrying us for quite a while. But the pact for migration, which the Commission passed a year ago, tried to incorporate a number of elements which would also offer support and protection. I mean, of course, civil society organizations, refugee groups, and others criticized this pact. But I mean, it was at least a means to go and document human rights violations on the borders, which is not possible in Poland right now. Now, the current EU presidency, Slovenia, has made a proposal too. Something is happening, apparently, irrespective of what happens in Belarus. And of course, the new German government will have to see what needs to be done, which means this is not about unconditional solidarity with Poland. This is also about the nitty-gritty in Brussels and here and there, attempts to stop the trend. I mean, the same goes for the Schengen Frontier Codex, which stipulates that you need to be capable of limiting fundamental rights there where there are attacks on the border. There's one more question, i.e., are there also organizations dealing with the border police? And then there is a comment. Erdogan and Gaddafi also committed extortion. And once again, concerning the border police, are there any trials yet? So that they are punished because they are violating the European Human Rights Convention, Article 3, notably. Now, concerning the trial, if nothing can be documented, it's hard to start a trial or to open a trial. And then, of course, I do want to underline that Polish NGOs also offer support. I mean, they do not differentiate whether it's a poor person or an officer belonging to the border police. they try to do what they need to do on the border, and they've just published a report in Polish. I hope it will be published in English soon about the situation on the border, at the border. So this is also about activists. It's not only about stranded migrants or refugees. It's also about the village people, the people living in those small towns who also need support. I mean, with the border police, it's like with soldiers. There are certain structures, but they are often not seen. These problems, I mean, because this is not part of the troop ethics. At least that's the Polish narrative. Maybe it's different in other countries.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir haben uns jetzt nicht ausreichend über das Narrativ unterhalten.
Right, we haven't touched upon the war narrative sufficiently. We should have, actually, or we could do this another time, because it's truly important and it is a problem. And of course, we need to discuss whether this narrative makes sense and what it's used for and what its implications are. But then let me remind you, even in war situations, there is a need for and a right to humanitarian support and media coverage. And that's why I'm surprised that there are so few in the EU who criticize or who get angry or who express their outrage at the situation. Now, we will have to talk about this another time, because we have reached the end of our program. Let me just remind you, the Geneva Convention has just celebrated its 50th anniversary, and there is also a lot of information on the website about it, and also about the rights of refugees and an attempt to do something about the undermining of refugees' rights. I think it's an excellent gift for the convention to work in this field. I would like to thank all panelists. I would like to thank all speakers. I would like to thank the audience, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.